My name is Liz Garst, and I'm going to be your question and answer moderator today. Today we have Mike Savara and Connor McDonald from Oregon Housing and Community Services and Becky Strauss from Oregon Law Center to come and present some information for you. I will let them introduce themselves, but I am going to just let you know a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. So today we're going to be talking about some rental assistance programs that are available now, some that will be coming later on. We're also going to have some information on programs that address long-term affordable housing needs. And then Becky is here from the Oregon Law Center to help us talk through the eviction moratorium and have some information on that. Just some brief housekeeping issues. We do have a lot of folks on the webinar today, so please do stay on mute. We are going to be recording this session, so we'll be sending the slides and the link to the recording after the session is done. And finally, we will have a lot of time for question and answers after the presentations. So if you could, please put your questions into the chat, and then we'll start going through them after we hear from our presenters today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let Mike and Connor take it over.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Connor McDonald. I work at Oregon Housing Community Services. We're the state housing finance agency, and the community services portion of our agency, we're really glad to have Mike Savara. He's our Assistant Director of Homeless Services. This is a really important topic that we'll be talking about today, and we are really impressed by all the work that you all have been doing throughout the COVID pandemic. We've been working with Dolly and Liz throughout, just want to commend like all the work that you're doing and what a difficult time this is, and how great it is also that OHA was able to contract with you all to do this really important work. Equity is at the center of our statewide housing plan. Addressing racial equity and other issues. And as you all very well know, housing is one of those topics in industries that's definitely rife with inequality. And our agency really is striving to increase homeownership rates. We also, as you'll hear from Mike a little bit later, work in homeless services. People experiencing homelessness are disproportionately people of color, which is unacceptable, and something that we really need to do a lot more work around. Today we'll be talking, as Liz said, about some of the immediate rental assistance resources that are available, some that are going to be coming online in the next few months. And then also we wanted to make sure that you all have sort of a baseline background on some of the existing long-term affordable housing resources that are out there, many of which do have really long waiting lists, but it's still really good information for you all to have as you're advocating for the people that you work with to get them into stable, affordable housing as well. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Mike to introduce himself, but I just wanted to start off, just ground us with that message.
Thank you, Connor. Yeah, it's so great to be with you all. I feel like we've heard for the last few months and really the last year just about the incredible work y'all are doing supporting folks. And I know I've interacted with a lot of you all in different settings, and we're just really happy to be here and talk a little bit more about sort of the path forward. And I won't belabor the point there, but we're just so appreciative of you. I think this conversation is long overdue around the intersection between health and housing, and making sure that we really have the strong sort of conversations, robust conversations between our different work. So really appreciate y'all, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. I've just got one screen, so it's a little bit tricky to be in presentation mode all at the same time, but we'll see how it goes. All right, so first, just as far as referrals into rental assistance programs that OHCS, Oregon Housing Community Services, funds, For the most part, we fund community action agencies to provide rental assistance programs. And some communities, some of you may be community action agencies, but in some communities, that's actually maybe part of the county government, and other places, it's a private nonprofit. CAPO, which is the Community Action Partnership of Oregon, on their website, they have a link, which we have here in the presentation, that we can also provide to you all, where you can find out who that community action agency is if you are not aware. Along with different rental assistance programs, they also provide energy assistance, weatherization, and lots of anti-poverty programs. Some of which may not directly help with rental assistance, but as you can imagine, if you can get help on your energy bill, that's also going to leave you a little bit extra money to be able to pay your rent as well. Also, continuums of care. So these are community-wide organizations that are committed to ending homelessness in a given community. They oftentimes do homeless prevention type of work. So helping someone back pay their rent. And they're generally also just a network. So oftentimes the community action agency is actually the lead of the continuum of care. But other times there's a host of other homeless service agencies. And frankly, it could be the food bank, the local food bank, and lots of other partners that are basically committed to trying to end homelessness in a given community. And it really serves as an umbrella organization that's helping with the role of connecting people with shelter services, or helping people that may be unsheltered in your community. They may have programs also to do street outreach, as an example. So you can also find who your continuum of care is in your given area. And oftentimes they have resources that are specific to people experiencing homelessness. Mike, I don't know if you want to take this one a little bit, since you're where you work with homeless services,
Yeah.
really implementing some of these different programs.
Yeah, definitely. So going to get a little bit here in the weeds here, but we want to make sure that y'all have sort of the latest information about current COVID rental assistance resources. So I'll talk about the STAR program first. So that's the first bulleted point here. So that's the Supporting Tenants Accessing Rental Relief, and we can drop the link to a webpage on our website, where you can find more information about the program in general, but also specific information about like how you call your local community action agency and who you would contact, and sort of the process by which you reach out. So STAR is a tenant-based rental assistance program. It is a $50 million rental assistance program that launched around February of this year and goes until about June 30th of this year. So different communities across the state have designed their programs and their access to their programs in slightly different ways. Some are using things like an online application portal. Some are using drive-through application assistance options, where you can actually like show up at a place and have a COVID-safe conversation with a caseworker to be able to follow through with a rental assistance process. Some are using phones. Some are using different ways of making sure that people have access to that information. There's also a lot of subrecipients that community action agencies enlist. So some of your organizations may be subrecipients of these dollars, that you may be administering these STAR rental assistance dollars out in the community to make sure that folks have access to these valuable resources. So a few kind of high level points that I want to mention about this program, and is related to others, is that it's really income targeted. So it's 80% area median income and below. And we can give a little bit more information about kind of what that looks like in each area, but it is really a sort of targeted program that's helping folks who are most likely to lead to eviction because their incomes are lower. Those income can be looked at in a few different ways. So it doesn't necessarily mean your entire last year's income. Folks lost a job more recently. We totally know that your income today might be different than your income all last year, but it still has a huge impact on your ability to pay rent. So different ways of making sure that people are able to determine their eligibility. Another piece is that it's a COVID program. And so there is a way for folks to essentially attest to how they were impacted by COVID. So a lot of these COVID rent relief programs, they build in this process where a tenant can say, I was impacted by COVID because of X reason. So that reason could be something like I was impacted by COVID because my expenses increased as a result of the pandemic, or I was impacted because I lost my job, or I'm on unemployment. And so those processes, we've tried to streamline and build those as easy as possible, because we know finding documentation from an old employer that maybe no longer exists is really difficult. So we do build in those processes to make sure that there's ease of access. It's not perfect. These programs are definitely not always the easiest to get through, and we're trying to find ways of easing those burdens as we learn about them and try to figure out that right balance of making sure that we're trying to get folks through the process and be able to access this assistance as quickly as possible. I want to mention the Landlord Compensation Fund really shortly here as well. So this is a $150 million landlord-driven rental assistance program that requires landlords to apply on behalf of their tenants. We run a single application portal across the state where folks can go in, the landlords can go in and apply for back rent, and they're essentially agreeing to forgive 20% of every dollar that they are requesting assistance for. So they would get 80 cents on the dollar, and essentially it's a way of making sure that landlords have access to making sure that those back rents can get paid, but they're still able to move through a process of ensuring that folks are moving into stability. So it really does help the tenant as well as the landlord in a lot of cases. And we kind of go into more detail if that's useful for folks, but it is definitely an incredible resource for landlords to be able to kind of take action and ensure that they have a solution for back owed rent. Other program I want to mention right here is the Wildfire Damage Housing Relief Program. So as you all know, in September of 2020, we experienced across the state a series of devastating wildfires. This program is really designed to support directly those households who are impacted by wildfires with direct cash assistance. So this program is structured essentially as if you had a home that was damaged or destroyed by the wildfires, you're eligible for, if you're below a certain income threshold, eligible for a direct cash assistance payment. Right now, those are $6,500 payments to ensure that folks are able to, pay their bills, get back on their feet, make sure they have access to food. There's really no restrictions on what they do with the dollars. It's really just a direct cash assistance, acknowledging that people who've lost their home to a wildfire need a lot of assistance to get back on their feet and back moving forward. So that's an awesome program we're really excited to be running, and there's a link directly to our website. You can apply online directly with OHCS. We'll be able to process your application and move through essentially trying to make sure that folks who are impacted by these wildfires are supported with direct cash payments. So it's not a rental assistance program in the traditional sense, but it is definitely helpful for folks who are impacted by these wildfires.
Great. And I think, Mike, if you want to work on this one as well. So these are some of the to-come programs. So the first one, just quickly to go over it. So the Federal Emergency Rental Assistance Program. This is a very large federal program that Treasury is running, and it's in total across the country, it's $25 billion. And our agency, OHCS, will be receiving a little bit over $204 million. And then there's also a bunch of local governments that will also be receiving rental assistance. I believe it's totaling $282 million. And so this is a program that Mike and his team are rapidly working on. And there's lots happening in this world and lots of conversations happening with local governments related to how to implement the program, and also getting input from community action agencies and other partners like that. So Mike, there's probably a lot more detail,
Yeah.
but I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, happy to jump in here. And I saw a couple of comments in the chat. We have heard access issues for these rental assistance programs that we've been operating for the last year are very real. So I don't want to paint a glossy-eyed picture that rental assistance is flowing from every tree. I think it's really important to you all are on the ground helping people try to access these resources, and like that's not always easy. It takes a lot of persistence. It takes a lot of know-how, and those access issues are very problematic for ensuring that we have equitable distribution of these resources, ensuring that communities most impacted by COVID have access. So I definitely don't want to insinuate that these are perfect programs, and we are learning, we are iterating, and we're trying to improve our processes and our distribution as we go. So a great example is this next wave of emergency rental assistance. We are trying a new strategy to ensure that access to this program looks a bit different. So there will be one application portal for the emergency rental assistance program statewide that our community action agencies and their partners will be operating on at the local level. So they'll be distributing the dollars and actually working with applicants directly, but there will be one application portal through a system, an electronic system we call OLITA. And that electronic system is not the only way someone could apply. They could still use a paper application with their local agency or community-based organization they're working with. But it is essentially trying to take the learnings that we've heard from many community providers that accessing rental assistance is difficult. It's not always clear the way to go about it, the right methods or the right strategies to take to actually get someone assistance. So it's really trying to move that into a place where it's visible, it's transparent, and that there's sort of a more centralized process for this. So we're working diligently on trying to build up this process to make sure that rental assistance through this program is available starting in May. And so essentially starting in May, you'll be able to go onto a portal that will essentially have a process where you can apply, or your folks can apply for assistance. Happy to dig into more of the details on some of those, and also able to give out some of the resources, but I also know our time is limited. But that program is forthcoming coming into May.
Great. And then just the other one on there, it's just there was a new act that passed, and there's still a lot more information that needs to come out, but essentially there's going to be another package of federal rental assistance as well as part of that. And I just wanted to address, as Mike said, getting through to different organizations can definitely be a challenge. And please feel free to reach out to myself or Mike to help with that. Sometimes if you contact us and we can get you more directly in touch with the people that you may be looking to get in touch with. So we're also happy to do that. And that's one of the reasons that we like coming and meeting with you all directly, is so that we can make sure that we can make those connections for you. So a little bit, here's just kind of some of the more quote unquote mainstream rental housing resources. So the first link on the left-hand side, is, so our agency, as I mentioned, we're the Housing Finance Agency. And so we've funded over 60,000 units of affordable housing across the state. And so that link, which you'll get out with the presentation, will take you to our webpage where you can actually look by county to see all of the buildings that are in your area. Granted, again, many of these have waiting lists or may have a closed waiting list, but some may have vacancies. But just wanted to make sure that you all are aware of these particular units and where they are. And then on the right-hand side too is a link towards where you can find different federal rental assistance. So these are properties where they're rent subsidized. Usually what this means is that the federal government has a direct contracting relationship with the building owner. And so folks would actually income qualify at the building and get the rental assistance directly there. And then there's also a couple other links. So USDA in rural areas, they provide some affordable housing, and then HUD has HUD assisted rental units as well. And this is a little bit different than the Housing Choice Voucher or Section 8 voucher program. And so then just the other one for you all to know, and again, many of these housing authorities may have long waiting lists or closed waiting lists, but actually, especially in some of the more rural counties, they oftentimes actually do have open waiting lists for programs. But these are, just wanted to make sure that you all were aware of housing authorities of Oregon and where those particular properties are where those housing authorities are located and how you can get on the waiting list or help your person that you're working with get on the waiting list for those programs. So just one quick thing, and I know we also have Becky on the line, and she's going to do a presentation on the eviction moratorium, but just wanted to make sure that you all were aware of some of the strategies. So I was a housing case manager. I worked in homeless services, worked with over 500 men in my time working in homeless services. And I think I helped just like over 220 people access permanent housing. And so one tool that I found really helpful was reasonable accommodations. And so it's always important when you're helping someone find a new place to live, it's always really important to kind of think like a property manager and know what the screening criteria will be. So when you get an application to look at what the screening is, and then look at yourself against that and see if there's any barriers. And so just want to make sure that you all were aware of reasonable accommodations and some other information that's available online to help you screen in. We know that too often property management owners screen out people, but there are not enough tools, but there are some tools that can help you if you are working with someone who does have screening barriers. With that said, I just have a couple links on here related to the statewide eviction moratorium. But really, I think you're going to best be served by having Becky do her presentation. So, we will take a look at the chat and answer some of the questions that came up as well. So thanks for having us today.
Thanks, Connor. Liz, did you want me to go ahead and do my presentation, or are we going to do Q&A?
No, I think go ahead and continue yours, and then we'll do the Q&A afterwards.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks everyone for having me here and for being here. I'm multitasking with my 3-year-old over here. Oh, great. My name is Becky Strauss. I'm a staff attorney with the Oregon Law Center. I use she and her pronouns. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'll give my presentation here. I'm going to breeze through this very quickly, but my job here today is to give an update on what the current eviction moratorium is here in Oregon and a little bit of insight into whether we see any policy changes at the end of the moratorium, kind of what the outlook might look like come July. I'm going to assume a lot of knowledge from this group about the moratorium, just because we're well into it, and I'm making assumptions that based on the work that you all do, that you have some of that grounding. But that said, I am going to go through the details of the moratorium quickly, and then talk about a bill pending currently called Senate Bill 282, touch briefly on the federal protections under the CDC moratorium, and then leave plenty of time for questions. So the key takeaways to the current eviction moratorium in Oregon are that this is not a rent forgiveness bill. So while non-payment of rent evictions are prohibited right now during this pandemic period, the rent is continuing to accrue, and at some point it will come due. But for now, up until July 30th, 2021, tenants cannot be evicted for non-payment of rent, and they cannot be evicted for no-cause terminations, with exception for what we call landlord-based terminations or no-fault, other types of no-fault termination that's not a tenant's fault, but the landlord has a business reason to end the tenancy. These protections are not automatic for tenants. I'm sure you all have learned this so far already. Tenants have to fill out and submit a declaration of financial hardship in order to receive the benefits of the moratorium. And if you don't mind here, I'm just gonna relocate my office while we're talking here. A little changing of the parenting guard. Okay, much quieter up here. Thank you. So What does the law say? For tenants who are qualifying tenants, meaning that they're experiencing financial hardship and they filled out the declaration, landlords are prohibited until July from doing any of these things. They can't deliver a termination notice based on non-payment of rent. Historically, these have been 72-hour notices. Now they're 10-day non-payment of rent notices. They can't file an eviction lawsuit based on non-payment of rent. They can't take any action to interfere with tenants' possession or use of the premises based on non-payment of rent. They can't assess a late fee or other penalty because of the non-payment. They can't report the tenant's non-payment balance as delinquent to a consumer reporting agency, and they can't file an action to recover the non-payment balance, meaning they can't go to collections. How do tenants qualify? We've talked about this. They have to get a copy of the hardship declaration, fill it out, and deliver it to their landlord. House Bill 4401 is very flexible in terms of what it means to deliver to the landlord. Tenants can submit it in person, in writing, by email. They can take a picture of the declaration and text it to their landlord or email it to their landlord. They just have to, they could even type signature, like an e-signature or type signature is fine. They just have to submit it and be sure to keep a copy for themselves for their record so that they show that they have submitted it. Landlords do have to tell tenants about their rights under the moratorium. There are 3 different points in the eviction process when landlords have to provide 2 specific documents to tenants. And if they don't do that, the eviction can't go through. The landlord has to provide a notice of rights to tenants, and they have to provide a copy of the blank eviction, the financial hardship form for tenants to fill that out. And landlords have to do that if they're giving an account balance statement, even if it's not a termination notice. If they're giving a termination notice, as I said, these are historically 72-hour notices, but right now they're 10-day notices based on House Bill 4401. And they have to give those 2 documents, notice of rights and the blank financial hardship form, if they're going to file in eviction court. Otherwise, the eviction can't go through. It can be dismissed. Well, I shouldn't say it can't go through. I would say the tenant has a defense to stop it from going through, but we are unfortunately seeing some of those that are slipping through. So this is what the financial hardship declaration looks like in statute. You've probably seen various copies of it on the Oregon court website, or that Multnomah County has printed out, or various forms that landlords are providing. But this is the language that it's meant to have in there. And what landlords are, or what tenants are attesting to, is that since March 16th, 2020, they have experienced any of these bulleted things: their loss of household income, increased medical expenses, loss of worker wages, increased childcare responsibilities, increased costs for childcare, for caring for a person with a disability, or any other circumstance that has reduced income or increased expenses. And note here, there is not a requirement that the hardship be linked to a COVID situation, only that the hardship is occurring. So tenants, if they can truthfully attest to that, they fill it out, they give it to their landlord, and then they get the benefit of cannot be evicted for non-payment through the end of June. Landlords can't challenge the declaration once it's in there. They can't ask for additional declarations, monthly declarations, multiple declarations per household. They can't say tenant isn't actually experiencing financial hardship. Once that declaration is in there, that is stands on its own, and the tenant is protected by the moratorium at that point. Landlords can't say you can only submit this in English, or they can't say you can only submit this in person, things like that. Anything that the law allows for they can't then limit it for their particular tenant. So we've talked a little bit about what landlords cannot do, but they are still allowed to do many things during the moratorium. They can terminate tenancies for people who have not submitted the financial hardship declaration. So again, very important that tenants who can't make rent get that financial hardship declaration and fill it out and give it to their landlord. Landlords can also use these landlord-based reasons to end the tenancy. So they can't use general no-cause evictions right now up through June, but they can end a tenancy if a landlord or immediate family member plans on moving in, if there's significant repair or renovation such that the unit can't be occupied, demolition or change of use, or if a landlord has accepted an offer from a buyer who intends to move in. Again, a flag here: landlords can't end the tenancy simply because they intend to put the unit up for sale. The termination has to come further in the chain than that. They have to have an offer in hand from a buyer who plans to move in. Landlords, of course, can continue to terminate tenancies for cause, meaning that the tenant violated the rental agreement. Typically, the timelines for those are 30 days with a 14-day chance to cure the problem, although different types of terminations might have a shorter time frame. And landlords can raise the rent currently. This is the eviction moratorium is not a rent freeze. So the current cap on rent increases for most tenancies, although there are some exceptions, is 9.2% rent increases. And there's some extra protections in the availability of relocation assistance in Portland. So just to cut to the chase here on timelines for tenants who have submitted the hardship declaration, both back rent, April through December, and current rent, it comes due in July 2021. If tenants have not submitted the hardship declaration, current rent is owed now. That started in January 2021, and back rent is now due starting in April. So again, if a tenant is in a position now in April where they have back rent and they can't pay it, they should be submitting the financial hardship declaration, and then they'll have the grace period up through June. So of note, currently in the legislative session is a proposal dealing with the eviction moratorium. It's not clear whether it will pass or not. It's too early in the session to know. Right now, it was just voted out of its Senate committee. It's awaiting a Senate floor vote, and after that, it will have to go through the House side and get signed by the governor. So there's a long way to go here, and it's unclear whether this will pass. But that said, this is the vehicle that is proposing to extend the grace period for non-payment of rent. The distinction here is this bill is not proposing to extend the moratorium. So regardless of whether Senate Bill 282 passes, in July, tenants will need to begin paying current rent. If this bill passes, the back rent that has accrued since April 2020 will be extended. The grace period for paying that back rent due will be extended to February 28th, 2022. And so that is a little bit of a cushion currently for tenants, and there's no financial hardship declaration requirement in Senate Bill 282. So if that passes, anyone with back rent will get that extension. But again, it's not contemplating extending the moratorium itself. A couple other things of note in the bill. The bill proposes to put protection so that landlords can't screen out new tenants based on any eviction judgment that has happened during the pandemic period, not just non-payment of rent evictions. And also it extends that protection to the expungement procedure. Currently, tenants can have prior evictions expunged or sealed under certain conditions. And so Senate Bill 282 would expand that availability of the expungement option for pandemic era eviction judgments. There are also some provisions in Senate Bill 282 that would suspend the enforcement of guest rules. One thing that we're seeing, we're a nonprofit civil legal services organization. A lot of our clients right now are, because of wildfires, financial hardship, what have you, doubling up in ways that they haven't before. And so what this bill would do would suspend the enforcement of guest rules and would prohibit landlords from enforcing occupancy rules that are unique to the building. They could still enforce, for example, a city imposed occupancy standard, but they couldn't enforce their own rules around guest rules or occupancy standards. And that's just in terms of like the number of nights that a guest is staying. It doesn't mean that guests wouldn't be subject to conduct codes that any tenant would be subject to. It's just to allow some flexibility to have tenants provide shelter for people who need it in these trying times. So I would encourage you all, if you're interested, to follow along with what's happening with Senate Bill 282, and hopefully that will pass. One quick note on the federal protections. The CDC has its own eviction moratorium, but we haven't really been using it because our Oregon moratorium is more detailed, it's more protective. So it's not really, we're fortunate in Oregon that we're not reliant on the CDC's moratorium. Hopefully we won't be in a position where that changes. Like if Oregon doesn't extend our moratorium and the CDC does, then we'll be looking more to the CDC. But for now, Oregon's protections are greater. That said, the federal moratorium was recently extended through June 30th, 2021. So it's actually in line with where our Oregon protections will end. And the two exceptions that I just want to note, if you're working with people that this might come up for, they could contact a lawyer and get some advice. If the eviction is for rent that came due before April 2021, there's some arguments that the CDC moratorium does apply to them, whereas our Oregon protections would not. Same with these landlord-based reasons that I talked about, the landlord moving in or doing repairs, those types of no-fault terminations. That would be a situation where the CDC moratorium might be more protective. And so a flag to get in touch with a lawyer for that tenant to see if that might be helpful. So that's my overview. Very fast, because I really just wanted to leave an opportunity for questions, and hope to have the opportunity to do that right now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you all.
Okay, we have lots of great questions in the chat. I think we'll go ahead and start with the moratorium questions because there are a lot of them, and then we can kind of circle back. Mike and Connor were able to answer some of the questions in the chat, but I think there's one or two we can get to in the end. But lots of questions on the moratorium. So let's get started, Becky. So for the first question, does a landlord have the right to prevent a tenant from renewing a contract due to unpaid or late rent payments?
So no is the answer. The protections under 4401 prohibit landlords from taking any action to interfere with use of the premises. So I would consider that to be kind of a retaliatory refusal to renew a contract. That said, under Senate Bill 608, there are limited circumstances anyway when a landlord can end a tenancy. So a landlord may decline to sign a new rental agreement, but the tenant shouldn't have to vacate. It would roll over for month to month. So I would say at the end of this, when I'm able to, I'll provide our intake line. And so I think if there are situations where people feel like there might be a violation of House Bill 4401 happening, those tenants can get in touch with legal aid and see if there's an attorney that could help them.
Okay, great. Are there specific resources for undocumented folks?
The protections in House Bill 4401 apply to all Oregonians, regardless of status. So there is not a carve out. There's nothing in the bill that is explicitly protective of tenants without status. Although for tenants in Portland, there is a provision that says that tenants who are applying for new leases don't have to provide immigration status information and can't be asked about that. So if someone is going through the lease-up process and feels like they're being targeted or asked questions based on status, those Portland specific protections are available. But House Bill 4401 is silent on status.
Okay, we had a question participant on what happens after June. And I also kind of just wanted to add on to that another kind of question. I know that at one point, Multnomah County had a stronger protection in place that allowed, it was the same date, but it allowed for non-payment until the end of September. And I'm just wondering if you've heard anything. I mean, obviously these protections end at the end of June. We've had them extended before. Have you had any conversations where you're, hoping that anything else, it might be extended or, there are certain parts of the state that might be able to extend protections, because I think, what we have in place clearly ends at the end of June.
Mm-hmm. So, I think what we've heard from Multnomah County commissioners is that they've been very open about their intention to act if the state doesn't. And to be honest, I'm not sure whether that stated intention is with regard to the moratorium as a whole or only the grace period. I would like to have faith that it's with regard to the moratorium as a whole, and that the county or in the city of Portland probably would be willing to extend beyond July. I haven't heard about that in other locations, although if we're in a position where the state is leaving a hole, I wouldn't be surprised to see some of the more, frankly, progressive jurisdictions or really bold jurisdictions do something like that. But it would end up being a patchwork that only people in certain communities would be able to take advantage of.
Okay, great. Our next question is, if a landlord refuses to accept a declaration, are there resources in those scenarios?
I would send that person to legal services. That's a clear violation of House Bill 4401, and there are damages available for tenants who, when their landlord is violating the moratorium. Okay, sweetie. So I think calling legal aid in those situations.
Do we have, the next question is, do we have anticipated number of evictions once this ends? Is there any data on kind of what the,
Oh gosh. There's a group called Stout Research Center that's been looking at census data on a regular basis and pulling out estimates for households that may be at risk of eviction. I think the last time I looked at that, the estimate was, I don't want to be misquoted here. I think it was somewhere in like the 60,000 range for a household for 1 month, like for the month of July. But it's so hard to get at those estimates. I mean, the other information that we have, hopefully maybe Connor or Mike have some better thoughts here, but we look at multifamily Northwest data with some regularity. They're the association of the larger multiplex landlords, private landlords, who have been reporting every once in a while through the pandemic their rates of non-payment from their tenants. And I think at last I looked, that was somewhere around, gosh, I think depending on the region and the type of housing, it's like somewhere between 6 and 12% non-payment, which is actually, generally lower, I think, than a lot of people assume. Most people are doing everything they can to make rent, putting things on credit cards and really struggling in a lot of ways to put rent first. So I think it's a big question mark. It's a very large number, and it's hard to get an accurate estimate is the unclear answer to that.
okay, our next question is, many families can't pay back what they owe. How do we advocate for these families in the most productive way possible?
I think that's a great question. In terms of a client services work, I think talking through with the client whether payment plans are possible or are the right approach. With a payment plan, a tenant never wants to agree to something that they can't keep up or that would compromise their rights that they otherwise already have. Like, for example, agreeing to pay more sooner or something like that, or with terms that they just can't comply with. But I think having some realistic conversations and some helpful advocacy around whether payment plans are possible, making sure that landlords know about the landlord compensation fund and resources that are available to them. I think those are really good starts. And then from a policy perspective, obviously advocating to the legislature and to local electeds with decision-making power to urge them and explain to them from your perspective that the pandemic is not over.
Okay, we have a few questions on payment plans. So kind of clarification first, if you're Do you have to pay everything back by July or just start making payments? And then also, are landlords allowed to refuse a payment plan? So maybe some kind of general information on what you suggest on how to negotiate a payment plan with your landlord, and what, from your experience, what might be some good resources or even organizations that you refer folks to who might be able to help help you determine that if that's not something you all provide.
Hmm. I mean, I think during the pandemic and the grace period, the biggest takeaway is that payment plans are voluntary. The more common unfortunate thing we see is that tenants feel pressured into a payment plan or don't necessarily realize that they don't have to agree to the landlord's terms of a payment plan. They have the protection of the moratorium. There's nothing that requires a landlord to agree to a payment plan, and there's nothing requiring a tenant to agree to a payment plan. I think in some cases it works out and it's good for the tenant, and maybe in some cases it's not, and it's probably is going to depend on the relationship with the landlord and how flexible they're willing to be. I mean, I think there are some helpful points of leverage. One is that I think it's very difficult, if not impossible, for landlords to access the resources available to landlords and tenants if the tenant is not in the unit. Um, so there's an incentive for everyone to to make it work. I also think it's just practically very unlikely that landlords are going to get paid once their tenant vacates. And so even accepting the 80/20 plan from the landlord compensation fund, these are all things in the landlord's best interest. Um, so similarly, I think coming up with a plan that works better for everyone rather than coming up to July 1 and evicting their tenant seems like a better business decision. The other thing that I'm not sure if it's really been a barrier, but early on in the pandemic, one of the things that the policymakers did was made it clear that accepting partial payments from landlords doesn't waive their right to collect the rest of the rent later, which is typically how the landlord tenant law has gone. So the legislature made a quick fix early on to say it's okay, landlords, to make a payment plan, and it's okay to accept a partial payment. You're not giving up your right to collect the whole thing at some, down the line. So I think that's helpful for those landlords who have sort of used that as a concern or an excuse to refuse the rent. But I don't have a great resource. I think you all are the best resource that we have to be helping tenants and our client community really work within the confines of their unique relationship with their financial circumstances and also their landlord to figure out is a payment plan workable, full well knowing what their rights are and that it's a decision that they can make without the risk of eviction hanging out over their heads.
And then for clarification, so if they do not, if the landlord does not accept a payment plan, then the expectation is that all the back rent be paid by July, and also July's rent be paid.
That's right.
Okay.
If
So,
the grace period is not extended. So if the
okay.
grace period is extended, that back rent will get kicked to February 2022.
Okay.
That's what Senate Bill 282 is proposing to do. Recognizing that July 2021 rent is going to be very difficult for thousands of tenants, but probably even more difficult is this back rent that people just, where are they going to come up with that money? So that it will at least delay and allow some of the new rent assistance resources to come online and get all of that money out, hopefully. Just a little more time to make that happen.
Okay, we have another point of clarification on the declaration. So, as I understand it, if a landlord plans to evict, the landlord must present the declaration form with the eviction. If the tenant fills out the declaration, does that nullify the eviction notice?
Yes. So, unless we're talking about kind of like nitty gritty technically. So, if a landlord gives, say, a 10-day non-payment of rent termination notice, and with that notice, landlord is required to provide the blank declaration form. So tenant then fills out the blank declaration form sometime within the notice period, within those 10 days. That landlord cannot then move forward with the eviction and cannot go file in court and cannot take any action to get the tenant out. I'm not sure if this question was getting down to this level of technicality. What does it legally do to the issuance of that 10-day non-payment of notice? Like, it, at the end of the moratorium, will the landlord have to give that notice again? I haven't really thought through that. I think the answer is probably yes. If for no other reason, then the amount owed probably will change. But that may be an interesting legal question if that was what was being asked. But I think that the effect of the tenant filling out the declaration form is that the landlord has to stop the process. And if the landlord continues the process, the landlord is liable for damages.
Okay, thanks for that clarification and getting through that rapid fire round of questions. We had a lot and we made it through
That's
that.
great. They're
those,
very
so,
smart questions. You all have clearly been, using this law, so that's great.
Okay, so going back to Connor and Mike's, we have the new rent assistance resources will allow 12 months and up to 15 months of back rent to be paid on behalf of the tenant, as long as they're under the 80% AMI. Is that correct?
Yeah, great question. So with the new rental assistance, the federal rental assistance program can pay back rent going back to April 1st of 2020. So that would be the first date that you could pay back rent. But then there's also the ability to pay forward rent up to, essentially it's 12 months with an additional 3 months eligible. So that's where you get that 15 if the need is still there at the end of that. There is a process where someone needs to sort of recertify, in a sense, every 3 months or so, according to the federal Treasury guidelines. And we're working on essentially using a re-up process so they don't have to go all the way back through the whole process, but they're able to sort of say, hey, yep, I'm still in need, still in the same situation, I'm still under 80% AMI. One other thing I wanted to mention, I didn't talk about it before, is that this program is not a first come, first serve program. So we know that oftentimes first come, first serve programs overserve folks who have the easiest access and the most rapid access to resources. So if you're more likely to know where to go for help, more likely to have those connections with different organizations or information, if you're oftentimes if you're not a person of color and you're not you don't have all of the privilege that white supremacy culture builds into it, we see that folks they're disadvantaged. And so trying to think about how to design a system so that there is an equity-based approach has been really important to us. So one of the things that we're using is we're building in a priority preference system for folks that are coming through the system. So if folks come to us, we're able to prioritize people who are lower than 50% area median income, which is one of the Treasury requirements. So lower incomes are more likely to result in eviction, as well as using an approach that essentially the Urban Institute data. Urban Institute does some great work on trying to map the impacts of COVID. So they're looking at essentially an index system all across the state, all across the country, to try to guess how badly impacted a specific census tract is based on a variety of different factors. So they look at an equity index, so really a number of factors underneath that. They're looking at a variety of things like number of jobs lost to COVID, as well as sort of trying to understand the health impacts, because COVID has clear health impacts as well as economic impact. So we're using that census tract data to try to inform where we should prioritize assistance across the state. So if I show up in one census tract that's a higher need census tract compared to a different census tract, I can be prioritized over that a person with all of the same factors. So the same income level, the same other factors, I'd be prioritized based on my location in the state. So happy to talk more about that. It's a little in the weeds, but we're wanting to build in systems that aren't just preferencing those who are most well off, but really trying to design the system to ensure that we're getting maximum community penetration.
Can I say something real quick? Thank you. So that really sounds amazing when you say that, Mike, but in reality, it's still extremely difficult, especially if you end up with a language that's not available easily, that easy access in language and access to technology. We still have people that struggle with technology or fast enough internet or a good enough computer, or they only have a phone, so it doesn't work that well on their phone. And I've asked this before. I still don't understand why. So when it comes down, I run a refugee organization, and it's me or our volunteer staff or our staff that are sitting for 2.5 hours to 3 hours with our clients, filling out these documents, filling out this paperwork. And in the end, we're still 8 months, 9 months into the waiting list, right? We haven't heard anything for rental assistance. Why not allocate pockets of money through the new system? So for example, Portland Refugees Support Group gets 100,000. I'd like a lot more, but let's just say 100,000. Then my system is set up for me to use those funds. Nobody else can use those funds. Then I know that no matter how much time it takes, I will be able to make sure that my clients are being served and not being outbid or out, typed or whatever in order to get those resources. So even though first come, first serve is great economically, it still doesn't take care of the fact that we have clients that have no idea this exists, that these resources exist, no matter how hard we try. But eventually they catch on by the time they catch on. And that includes CBOs too. Like I caught on late. I didn't know these resources, or I didn't know the STAR program was available. By the time we catch on, funding's gone, or the waiting list is really long. So why can't we be allocated those funds and some funds for capacity so that we can also, help out and make sure that that equity is seen across the board?
It's a great question, and I honestly I couldn't agree more with like all of those like all of the experiences you just named in terms of like how to make sure that access is actually happening to communities who are most impacted. I think the answer is a bit complicated, so bear with me here. But our the balance of trying to respond with urgency and say like we need to get the dollars out quickly, but also recognizing that these are federal dollars with a lot of weird restrictions. So like weird restrictions around what you can spend the dollars on for admin, around reporting requirements, a lot of strange requirements around like those federal regulations that frankly inhibit the ability to respond quickly. So a great example is that if we wanted to go broadly and try to get a ton of folks involved, we would be delayed in getting the dollars out. If we wanted to try to get that request for applications all the way out and sort of flood the number of folks, the number of providers. What we're trying to do with this approach is sort of a hybrid in a sense. So every community action agency is submitting a plan, a proposal in their region. And they're going to tell us, here's exactly who I'm working with. Here's my plan to reach all the members of my community. And if the community plan doesn't demonstrate a level of partnership and collaboration with a variety of partners and a thoughtful response to ensuring that folks who are disadvantaged and not able to access those resources, like if they're not subbing out and working with other providers, then we won't accept the plan. Like we won't just like rubber stamp it and move it forward. And I think that approach allows us the flexibility of getting the dollars out quickly, but also puts the accountability on the local providers to build those collaborative relationships and say, all right, who's in my network to make sure that I am partnering with a variety of folks. We also did a request for information a few 2 months ago, I believe. Folks applied and sort of said, hey, I'm interested in this. And we were able to connect those community action agencies who are going to be the sort of lead applicants doing that rental assistance program with the RFI respondents and said, hey, like talk together. We want to make sure that there's a level of accountability, and we're saying like you need to evaluate and vet each of these RFI respondents to make sure that they are fitting into the plan in some form or fashion. It doesn't necessarily mean you're getting an allotment of 100K, but it could mean that you're a designated community provider with access to actually plugging in your clients into the system. So you could actually like load your clients into the system and get them through the process. that is no way like the perfect plan. Like if we had more time, more frankly, more administrative dollars, the administrative dollars are capped at 8.5% of the overall allocation, which is very little. Up until a week and a half ago, it was only direct expenses, so no indirect costs, which are critical to ensuring the viability of a nonprofit's sustainability. So like all of those pieces, I think, contribute to the need to like really evaluate how we're doing this. The other thing I'll say is that this is not the end of the conversation on rental assistance. So there's actually two waves of rental assistance. There's this first wave of rental assistance that we're working with right now, the 204 million, 282 total. And then the American Rescue Plan Act that came in March is also allocating an additional allotment of emergency rental assistance dollars that does have a bit more generous flexibility and options for how we do that administration. So it's not the end of the conversation, and we would love to keep talking. I know we're at time, so we'd love to keep talking with you all specifically about like what this looks like moving forward, because we hear you and we want to try to understand how we can respond and do a better job of serving the folks that you're working with.
Okay, well, we are at time, and I wanted to thank everybody today for coming on. We had a lot of folks on this webinar, and I'm really glad, and very much thank you to all of our presenters for being able to provide some information today. So there was one last question on how do we access these resources for our clients. Again, those are going to be the links that are going to be sent out in the presentation. So we are going to send the link to we are going to send the presentations and then also send the link to this recording. For folks who may not have been able to join. And it sounds like Mike and Connor, that you guys can make some individual connections too between community-based organizations and community action agencies, and they can kind of play that connector role. So please do, they're both fabulous. So please do use that ability to kind of make those connections, because I think it's really important. And I really appreciate your comments, Nora. And I think that you've outlined some, when we have more flexibility, some amazing ways to think about how we can, continue to do this if we do have a little bit more flexibility. So I really appreciate that as well. Okay, well, everybody, we could keep talking about this, but I want to let everybody go because it is the end of the day. But really, thanks everybody for joining. I appreciate everybody's